Welcome to one and all. Once again, I'm in the car, and rather than just punt tonight's recording, here we are. And welcome to episode 46 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I always like to kind of mix it up a little bit, a little spooky, a little creepy, maybe Halloween-ish, 2+ months late. But if you're joining me for the YouTube version of the podcast and haven't done so already, don't forget to click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. Or if you're joining me for the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or the other platforms, same general rule applies. If you haven't done so already and you enjoy the content, don't forget to click like and subscribe. So I'm going to kind of pick up from where I left off with episode 44, which I called Tales from the Movie Trenches, or Tales from the Hollywood Trenches. And I'm going to pick up the narrative of after I ran into a brick wall with my adaptation of Alfred Sloat's classic children's / young adult novel, The Biggest Victory. But I used it to sign with a big agency, literary agency that would be in Beverly Hills, and latched on to a literary agent and producer who is very, very well respected in the industry, who unfortunately has since passed. And he understood the situation that the screenplay adaptation of Sloat's The Biggest Victory was not usable from the marketing standpoint. As I say, he made that joke about, you're not David Mickey Evans, but you're good. And I like this script and it could totally be a movie. He wasn't able to market it. So what we did was we went to work on one of my other screenplays. It's actually the script that I wrote fourth in my so-called screenwriting career, my blossoming career. And the screenplay has the same title that it does now, The Day of the Lamb. And obviously there was a little bit of an issue because that's a little bit close to Silence of the Lambs. But my argument was that my script, the title, The Day of the Lamb, made more sense. It doesn't really matter. That was the title of the script. And it was set in and around Atlantic City, my first iteration of it. And it was about a card counter who gets into some hot water with casino bosses in Atlantic City. There was the potential for something much better, but the craft wasn't quite there. Again, I was only 23 when I wrote this. And the agent that I was working with, he liked it, but he saw greater potential. He said, you need higher stakes, and you need to rethink the villain, because the villain scenario as presently constructed doesn't work. And there are a lot of lazy scenes that you can either tighten up or cut. So he told me, kid, take a month, and I want you to come up with something. I want you to come up with something as far as a new villain, and I need you to broaden the scope of the story. The idea is that this is kind of action, crime, thriller. We don't know if in the best case scenario, are we talking a huge budget or not? But you need to up the stakes, up the ante, and up the tension. Basically, it needed more of everything and less of the shit that already didn't work. So I took a month and I sort of fractured the narrative, where I started to think in terms of a Pulp Fiction-ish structure, where the story is not told in a linear fashion, where you have what appear to be two parallel narratives taking place with the same protagonist at different times, and you don't exactly know what the hell is he doing in Atlantic City. It looks like his partner got bumped off. He's a police officer. It looks like his partner has gotten bumped off. And then there are these characters from South Africa. And then the FBI and Interpol and all of these other organizations, criminal organizations or crime-fighting organizations, are involved. What the hell is going on? And this was all deliberate. It was deliberate misdirection. The idea was I was setting the story up like a big puzzle that the audience was supposed to try and solve before the final bout. And he liked it, but he thought that it needed more work. In other words, that I had taken steps forward, but it wasn't ready. And as things go in the movie business, it ended up not working out with this agent. He got overrun with family stuff and personal stuff, and he had to kind of take a step back from all but his most prolific clients. And in this instance, when I say prolific, I mean people who didn't actually need any notes before he would submit, even though he would always give notes anyway. But writers who he would submit stuff and they would be getting paid, like that kind of thing, as opposed to there being a kind of uncertainty. So I parted ways with him, and I continued, working, continued writing. And with that script, again, having been improved, but I didn't really know if anyone was going to be interested in it, I began work on what I believed, at least at the time, to be the most urgent, the most cinematic baseball story that had yet to be told on film. And that was and is the story of the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers. That's the year that Brooklyn won their first and only World Series championship. Now, just saying that's not a movie. That's a documentary. If you're going to tell a story of the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers, where the drums were beginning to beat that the team was going to move to Los Angeles, and are they going to get a new stadium? I mean, historically, obviously, we know they're not going to get a new stadium. But I knew that I was going to tell a family story, events that took place in my own family, and use that World Series as a backdrop. Not a reconstruction, not a documentary, but a story about fictional characters based on fact, and then the true events of the 1955 World Series as kind of the spine of the narrative. And a little bit difficult as a diehard Yankee fan. My grandfather, who had been a Yankee fan since the fucking 20s, for crying out loud, as he would say, he and my dad, both diehard, dyed in the wool, watch every pitch of every game, especially my dad, Yankee fans. They got a kick out of the fact that I was writing a screenplay where, in a sense, the Yankees are the bad guys. They're the antagonists. But I did a lot of research. I found out some really cool historical stuff that took place in and around the 1955 World Series, the 8 days of the 7-game 1955 World Series, I believe September 27 to October 4th, 1955. And I needed a main character, and I came up with the idea that the main character is going to be 16, but very kind of advanced, and a senior in high school, and he is written as the best teenage baseball player in the borough of Brooklyn. So good, in fact, that the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Boston Braves at the time offer him contracts to skip the rest of high school and just go right to the low minor leagues. And then there's the kind of classic familial strife. The mom is contemplating having an affair. The father is struggling. The grandfather is having problems because he thinks the Dodgers are going to lose another World Series. And the main character starts a romance with a girl that he has been friends with for quite some time, and all of this stuff takes place as the 1955 World Series plays out. And we really don't know, again, historically, we know the Dodgers are going to win the World Series, but all of the family stuff, the strife, the infighting, the kid trying to figure out, am I just going to punt the rest of high school and fuck college and just go to play baseball? Or am I going to do what's probably the safe thing, which is continue on my path, go to a 4-year university and start a professional career? So all of these things play out in my script, and I went through a number of drafts, and the early buzz from people that I knew was fantastic, but you can't really trust that, because in most cases, if they're family, if they're friends, they're not going to say, bro, you ought to take up a different, try another line of work, maybe animal husbandry, because you sure as fuck aren't cut out for this writing thing. But I started to send the script around. Now, bear in mind, unlike the previous baseball script, Biggest Victory, retitled In Love and Baseball, this was an original script. This property belonged to me entirely. There were no rights issues, nothing, just me. And so I began sending the script around. And lo and behold, a literary manager read it, and then she read The Day of the Lamb, the kind of crime thriller action script that I had worked on with the agent, and she thought that they were both just about in sellable condition as they were. She said, yeah, I mean, we can tinker with both of them, but I feel like what you've got here, they're going to get picked up. These are really well-written and good stories, especially the one about the Dodgers. So I signed with this literary manager and did some rewrite work. And she had a number of contacts, even though she wasn't a big name, she had a number of contacts within the film industry. And she sent it to the most kind of connected producer that she knew and a filmmaker that she also knew. And again, I'm not talking about, this isn't Jerry Bruckheimer and this isn't Spielberg, but people can make a great living and be super talented and real ballers from the artistic and creative standpoint without the average film fan knowing who they are. So she got the script to a producer who really liked it, was ready to make the movie. And she got it to a director who I hadn't heard of, but I knew a little bit of his work. I had heard of a couple of his films, and he loved it. So much so that he called, and we spent a half hour on the phone with him telling me he couldn't believe how choked up he had gotten by the end of the story. He said, that the way you set it up, it seems like it's going to be kind of corny and over the top and saccharine, but man, I was bawling my head off at the end. So I took that as a very serious compliment. So basically, a producer and a director were ready to go. Right around this time, my manager put in a phone call to Elijah Wood's agent, and the agent said, you know what, go ahead and send it. And then about a week after that, with all of this amazing stuff happening, I got a phone call at home on a landline. I didn't have a cell phone yet. Again, this is literally the year 2000. Not everybody had cell phones back then. I get a call from a female, woman's voice. Is this Jeremy? Yeah. She says, oh, I'm glad I got you. And I forgot her first name. I'm sorry. It was Elijah Wood's mom calling me because the script had come into her home and she didn't know what to do with it. So she explained to me, she said, yeah, this came care of Elijah's agent, but it's a little bit, I don't know what to do because he's in New Zealand. He was in New Zealand shooting Lord of the Rings. So I laughed and she laughed and we talked for like another 10 minutes, just random stuff. She's such a nice lady. She was so nice on the phone. Like somebody listening to the conversation would have thought, oh, they know each other for sure. They're friends. We were chatting like we were old buddies. So the upshot of it was that Elijah Wood was not going to be able to do this movie, even though his agent had expressed preliminary interest because he was going to be tied up with Lord of the Rings. And, they shot all three of those films. In the words of John Sterling, buck to buck to buck, and a belly to belly to belly. So that didn't work out. And as we were still trying to move forward, say, okay, we have a director, but he doesn't have a studio deal, and a producer with good credits, but she doesn't have a studio deal, the manager approached Dustin Hoffman's people. And Dustin Hoffman, a New Yorker, whatever, he had started to express interest in directing, and Dustin Hoffman's producing partner, Murray Shizgal's a writer, one of the writers of Tootsie, he said, he'd probably like it, but there's no way we're going to do it. And it sounds like you guys are wanting to move and you're looking for somebody who can get involved right now. I guarantee you, Dustin's not your guy. It's okay. No problem. No harm, no foul. And the manager said that Shizgal, man, what a nice guy. And he just sounded brilliant on the phone. So she then put in a call to Kevin Costner's production company. Now, Costner did have a studio deal, not surprisingly, TIG Productions. He had just made For Love of the Game, which is another baseball film. Costner, of course, did Field of Dreams and Bull Durham. And For Love of the Game, which to me is the weakest of those three. It's okay. It's just okay. Billy Chapel, great name, right? Wink, wink. So she put in a call. She said, listen, I know that Kevin just did a baseball film, but my client here wrote you really what we think is terrific. And she explained, we have a producer, director. I'd like Kevin to at least give it a look if it's possible. I know he loves baseball, and even if he's not interested, I still would like him to read this and just give us give us his honest appraisal. So Costner's assistant said, yeah, no, of course, we understand. Yeah, he's not going to do it. He's not going to jump right back in and do another baseball movie, but absolutely, I'll have him read it. And maybe he knows the people that you're talking about. That I don't know. I'm not sure of. So she sends a hard copy of the script to Kevin Costner. And Costner writes a letter to her, which I wish I had. But he wrote a letter. It's a hard copy. I think he typed it out. I mean, look, he could have been dictating it, I assume, right? He probably dictated it to his assistant. But he basically said, I can't do another baseball film, but I wanted you to know, and I wanted your client to know, I really like this script. And I'm almost sorry that I just did a baseball film, because I totally see this, and this would make a great baseball movie. I like the humor. I love the historical tidbits, the stuff with Joe Torre, which was in there, the stuff with transistor radios, and the historical quirk, which is crazy, that James Dean died during that World Series. I believe he died between games 3 and 4. That's a crazy fact, but it happened. And I worked that into the story. So Costner was just throwing bouquets of praise. Tell the writer I loved his script. And if you don't mind, can I keep a copy of it with me, unless you need me to send it back? Well, needless to say, the literary manager did not ask for the script back. She was so happy, even though he essentially turned us down. There was no reason for him to lie. He could have just said nothing. He said, you know what, it was a nice story, I'll pass. Good luck. But he took the time to tell us how much he enjoyed it. And I feel like he was being straightforward. Why would he lie? For what? So as time went forward, the agent, that is, or the manager, continued to submit The Day of the Lamb, and we had a lot of people interested, like Chris O'Donnell's agent thought it was really cool, but he was tied up. He was away making Vertical Limit at the time, and then he had a movie behind that, so that wasn't practical, and we never got any momentum with The Day of the Lamb, even though the people who she spoke with, who read it, all liked it and said, this is a movie. It's written in a very cinematic way, and I'm sure that somebody's going to pick it up. What ended up happening with the Brooklyn Dodgers script, which I called An Empty Place, a bit of a metaphorical meaning, because the grandfather, as he's going over the horror, like Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now, but as the grandfather, whose name is Abe in the world of the story, is going over the just awful history, the tragic history of the Dodgers, losing so many World Series, having shitty teams, and then losing 5 World Series to the Yankees going into 1955. With the idea that the team is probably going to be moving sooner rather than later, he says, there's an empty place in Brooklyn's heart. We have to win this time, meaning the 55 World Series. Because the story, my screenplay opens the night before the World Series starts in 55. That's the kind of backdrop. So, unfortunately, the director and the producer, from what I could gather, because I wasn't involved in this part of it, the director and producer began butting heads. Or maybe they just didn't like each other from the start. I don't know exactly what the mechanics were, but they both kind of very quietly exited the project. And that left it just to the literary manager to continue to kind of now send it around completely uncovered. See, the thing is, then as now, if you have talent attached, you have a better chance. So when we had a producer and a filmmaker, both with, hey, some pretty good credits here, we had a better shot. And we weren't able to get anything going with that momentum. We weren't able to seal any deals or lock anything in or get anything going. So she continued to send the screenplay around, and man, so many different people. Like, I got unsolicited phone calls from a lot of different people in Hollywood, all saying the same general thing, which is, how much work did you do on this? This is a ton of research. Like, you couldn't have just written this from the seat of your pants. Like, did you have a technical advisor, or how did you do this? Because people were taking note of the number of it's just strange that there were so many major historical events that took place in that time frame. And I got a lot of laughs out of the shit with the transistor radios. Like, that's something that I didn't know. But it was still the somewhat early days of the internet, but there was enough information. You know, if you Google when did transistor radios come out, they were pioneered and created not long before. And there's a great scene, I think a great scene in the script, where one character has the first transistor radio that was released, which was a piece of crap, it barely played, and the main character has one that actually is a good radio. And so there's a lot of that kind of topical humor, but it's a humor that still plays. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get anyone else interested in getting behind either An Empty Place or The Day of the Lamb. And, you know, Hollywood, as they say, is the only place in the world where people can, the quote is that they can nice you to death. The other quote is, it's the only town where they'll smile and shake your hand while they're sticking a knife into your back. But in this instance, it wasn't that. It was the first thing. It was the fact that so many people went out of their way, unsolicited. Another great word in Hollywood. He sent an unsolicited screenplay. But unsolicited praise, which, you know, it's good. It's nice to hear. It validates your effort, but it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't help you to further your own career unless you're able to, for example, latch on with a literary agent, a manager, or, you know, somebody makes you an offer. And it kept feeling like it was moving in the direction of offers, further offers, but it just didn't happen. And sometime in 2001, the literary manager, who herself was a writer, we kind of parted company. And unfortunately, we never got anything done. And it's sad because she worked her tail off. And, you know, the number of people who I respected and were huge fans of, like Costner, like Dustin Hoffman, like Chris O'Donnell. You know, I don't know if O'Donnell ever actually read my script. The agents seem to indicate that he had, but I don't know that he really did. But at this time, and this is going to be another story, because from An Empty Place, I got another gig, a theoretically bigger gig, writing a story about a famous football player who was actually still very much alive at the time. He died, I think, in 2017. But a famous football player from football's kind of golden era, 50s and 60s. And it was somebody who I had heard of, and I knew of him, but I didn't actually know that much about him. But a filmmaker, a music video director to be precise. He had worked with Pearl Jam, and I think he'd been nominated for an MTV Movie Award in the early to mid 90s. I'm not sure exactly which video, but he was looking to make a movie about this, kind of legendary football player. And there, again, had been no movies made about this guy, no documentaries, no nothing. So it was a story that kind of untapped potential. And he wanted a writer who was comfortable writing about sports and mixing sports with family, with real life stuff, not just a straightforward story of sports achievement. And he read An Empty Place. And by this point, I was working with another agent. And he told the agent, who was a mutual friend, that I want this guy. This is the guy. I want to work with this guy. And so contracts were signed. And my task was, because it was actually a book adaptation, it wasn't a simple random story of a football player. He had acquired the rights to a book. Now, I was, in theory, supposed to adapt the book, but there was nothing to adapt in the book. This was the kind of thing where I was going to have to do, again, outside research and probably other books to fill in the gaps, because there was nowhere near. It's not that the book was short, but it was not a very cinematic novel. Nonfiction. It was a memoir by the daughter of the football player. But I agreed to do the adaptation. We signed paperwork, parameters of a deal, etc., etc. And I started work on the screenplay, which, without giving anything away, was called Giants and Heroes. The daughter who wrote the memoir was heavy into Roman and Greek mythology, hence giants and heroes. And the protagonist, the main character, the real life guy, is a bit of a tragic figure, like the old gods and the old stories of the Romans and the Greeks. The stories of people like, Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. And I did a ton of research, way more than I had done for the Brooklyn Dodger script. I tore through not just the book I was supposed to adapt, but this guy wrote an autobiography. And there was a lot of other material about the era, about what did streets look like in California, this part of California in 1957. What did upstate New York? What did Westchester look like in the 60s? And all of these things that I figured it out, and I outlined, and I started working on the screenplay. And that's a story that I'm going to have to tell in another podcast, but I'm not going to be a complete a-hole and not tell you who it is. It is the late, great, next to Dan Marino, the greatest quarterback who never won a championship, Yelburton Abraham Tittle Jr., or Y.A. Tittle, two-time NFL Most Valuable Player and Player of the Year, and to this day still holds part of a record, most touchdown passes in a single game, 7. Good old Yat. And that'll have to be the story of another podcast, the just absolute craziness that unfolded with my drafting of the script, going through multiple iterations of it, and what ended up happening with this property in the final, in kind of final summation. But that will have to wait for another podcast. And with that, we have reached the end of episode 46 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. More tales from the Hollywood trenches, I think we'll call this one. If you've watched episode 46, if you've followed me home here, almost literally, on the YouTube channel and haven't done so already, please don't forget to click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. This way you get notified anytime a new video drops. Or if you've joined me for the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, or Amazon Music, and haven't done so already, click like, subscribe, and turn on the subscriber bell. Excuse me, turn on the notifications bell. It's a long ride home, getting a little loopy. But I will be back with episode 47 real soon. Take care. Good night.